Christmas, a time for joy, laughter, and family gatherings. But beneath the festive lights and snowy streets, there are tales that send shivers down your spine. Tonight, we'll explore 6 chilling stories from the heart of New York, where the holiday cheer turns into unspeakable terror. From haunted snowmen to sinister subway rides, these Christmas nightmares will make you think twice about the magic of the season. Turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself for the darker side of Christmas. Story number 1. The haunted pine tree at Rockefeller Center. The Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center was an iconic tradition, a symbol of holiday cheer that brought millions of people together every year. Standing tall and proud in the heart of Manhattan, it was the city's crown jewel, its lights illuminating the plaza and lifting spirits even on the darkest winter nights. But in December of this particular year, the tree was different. It had been chosen from a small, unremarkable town upstate, a towering Norway spruce, its branches thick and lush. It was deemed perfect by the city's decorators. The family who donated it seemed eager to be rid of it, though their enthusiasm was chalked up to pride. "It's been in our backyard for generations," the father said as workers carefully began the process of cutting it down. His wife stood nearby, her face pale and expressionless, her hands clutching their young daughter's shoulders. The girl stared at the tree with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Is something wrong, sweetheart?" one of the workers asked. The girl didn't respond. She simply shook her head and whispered something her parents didn't catch. But the worker heard it, clear as a bell. "Don't wake it up." The tree arrived in Rockefeller Center days later, its massive trunk carefully mounted and secured. Crews worked tirelessly to string lights, attach ornaments, and prepare it for the grand lighting ceremony. As the final touches were applied, whispers began to circulate among the workers. "Did you hear that?" one asked, stepping back from the tree. "It's like a sigh, probably the wind," another replied, though the air was still that evening. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Thousands gathered to witness the tree's lights blink to life, their cheers echoing through the plaza. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. Visitors reported feeling uneasy around the tree, as if something were watching them from its shadows. Children cried and refused to approach it. The lights, once steady and cheerful, began to flicker erratically, dimming at odd intervals as though responding to an unseen pulse. On Christmas Eve, the plaza was packed. Tourists posed for pictures, their laughter blending with the hum of the city. Among the crowd was a man named Evan, a security guard tasked with patrolling the area. He had worked at Rockefeller Center for years and thought he'd seen everything. But that night would change everything. At around 11 p.m., the crowd began to thin, leaving only a handful of stragglers. Evan leaned against a railing, his breath fogging in the cold air, when he noticed something strange. The lights on the tree were flickering again, but this time there was a pattern, a rhythmic pulse, almost like breathing. He radioed his partner. "Lights are acting up again. Can you check the controls?" "On it," came the reply. Evan approached the tree, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. As he got closer, he felt an odd warmth radiating from the tree. He frowned, reaching out to touch one of the lower branches. Felt damp, almost sticky, when he pulled his hand back. His fingers were smeared with a dark, sap-like substance that smelled faintly of iron. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the tree's massive trunk. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a face, twisted in agony, pressed against the bark. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Hey, Dan," he said into his radio. "You seeing anything weird on the monitors?" There was no reply. Static crackled through the speaker. Evan's pulse quickened. He turned toward the security booth. But before he could move, a low, groaning sound filled the plaza. It was deep and resonant, like the creaking of ancient wood under strain. The lights on the tree dimmed, then flared bright enough to hurt his eyes, Shadows danced across the plaza, and Evan realized with a jolt that they weren't cast by the lights. They moved independently, flickering and writhing like living things. The groaning grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. Evan clapped his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees. The tree's branches shook violently, shedding needles and ornaments, and then he saw them, figures, dark and indistinct, emerged from the trunk. Their forms shimmered like heat waves, their faces featureless but somehow exuding pure malice. They moved jerkily, as if struggling against an invisible force, their limbs twisting unnaturally. Evan scrambled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. One of the figures turned toward him, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, though it had no eyes. Evan felt its gaze pierce through him. The figure raised an arm, its hand elongating into a claw-like appendage, and pointed directly at him. Evan's body froze. His limbs locked in place as an icy chill seeped into his bones. From deep within the tree, a voice echoed. It was low and guttural, each word vibrating through the air. "You should not have woken us." The figures surged forward, their movements becoming more fluid, more coordinated. Evan broke free from his paralysis and stumbled to his feet, sprinting toward the security booth. Behind him, the groaning intensified, mingling with the sound of splintering wood and the terrified screams of the few remaining visitors. He burst into the booth, slamming the door shut and locking it. Dan was slumped over the monitors, his face pale and his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Evan shook him, but Dan didn't respond. On the screens, the tree's lights pulsed violently, and the dark figures spread out across the plaza, their forms blending with the shadows. Evan grabbed the radio and called for backup, his voice frantic. "We need help at Rockefeller. Something's wrong with the tree." The response was immediate, but it didn't bring comfort. "What are you talking about? The plaza's clear. We've got live feeds showing nothing unusual." Evan stared at the monitors. The figures were still there, moving closer to the booth. He turned to the window, but the plaza outside was empty. The tree stood still, its light steady and bright, as if nothing had happened. But Evan knew better. The warm sap on his fingers, the groaning, the figures, it was all real. He backed away from the window, his heart pounding. As he looked at Dan again, he noticed something he hadn't before, a dark, branching pattern spreading across his colleague's skin, like veins or roots. The groaning began anew, louder this time, as the lights on the monitors flickered and went dark. Evan's scream was swallowed by the silence that followed. The next morning, the tree was the center of a media frenzy. Officials claimed a minor electrical fault had caused the lights to flicker and dismissed rumors of any strange occurrences. Evan's disappearance was quietly reported as a personnel matter, but those who had been there that night knew the truth. And every year since, when the Christmas tree is lit, some claim to see faces in the bark, twisted in silent screams, and shadows flickering among the branches, moving to the rhythm of a breath that no one dares acknowledge. Story number 2. The ghost train on Christmas Eve. The subway was almost empty that night, the platform lit with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above the quiet hum of the city. Outside, the streets of Manhattan glistened with freshly fallen snow, and Christmas lights twinkled in the windows of nearby buildings. But beneath the festive facade, in the cold, damp depths of the subway station, everything felt desolate. Claire checked the time on her phone. It was 11:47 p.m., and the last train would be arriving any minute. She was coming back from her office holiday party, her heels pinching her feet and her head buzzing faintly from one too many glasses of cheap champagne. All she wanted was to get home, change into her pajamas, and leave the awkward small talk of her coworkers behind. The subway car screeched into the station, its brakes whining like a wounded animal. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing an empty train. Claire hesitated for a moment, her breath fogging in the cold air. She'd ridden the subway countless times, but something about the stillness of the train unsettled her. "It's late," she muttered to herself, stepping inside. Of course it's empty. The doors closed behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. She chose a seat near the middle of the car and settled in, pulling her coat tightly around her. The train began to move, the familiar jolt of acceleration reassuring her. She stared out the window, watching the dark tunnels blur past. That's when she noticed him. At the far end of the car sat a man in a Santa suit. His red jacket and hat were pristine, the fluffy white trim almost glowing under the harsh lights. He held a large sack, which rested on the floor between his boots. For a moment, Claire felt a wave of relief. At least she wasn't entirely alone. Maybe he was just a holiday performer heading home after a long day. The train stopped at the next station. The doors opened, but no one boarded. Claire glanced at the Santa. He hadn't moved, but she could have sworn his head had turned slightly, as if he were watching her. The doors closed, and the train resumed its journey. Claire shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how loud her breathing sounded in the empty car. She glanced at the man again. This time, his posture had changed. He was leaning forward, his hands gripping the edges of his sack. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but she could feel his attention on her. The train stopped again. Claire's eyes darted to the doors, hoping someone else would board, but the platform was deserted. When she looked back, the man was closer. He had moved to the row directly across from her. His sack slumped in the aisle. Claire's heart began to race. "Merry Christmas," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Claire forced a smile, her hands tightening around the strap of her purse. "Merry Christmas," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his sack, his hand disappearing into its depths. Claire's mind raced. Was he pulling out a weapon? Present? Something worse? She stood abruptly, gripping the pole beside her. "This is my stop," she lied, stepping toward the doors as the train slowed. The man's head snapped up. For the first time, she saw his face clearly. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were two hollow pits of darkness. His lips stretched into a grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellow. But the worst part was his face itself. It didn't look real. It was like a mask, the features too perfect, too fixed. "Stay," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally through the car. "We're just getting started." Claire bolted for the doors, but they didn't open. The train sped past the station, its lights flickering violently. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The man was standing now, his sack abandoned on the floor. He took a step toward her, his boots clanging against the metal floor. "What do you want?" Claire screamed, pressing herself against the doors. The man tilted his head, his grin widening. "To take you somewhere special," he said, gesturing to the darkness outside the window. "You'll love it. It's quiet, peaceful." The train plunged into total darkness. The lights in the car went out, leaving only the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking. She turned on the flashlight, swinging it wildly. The man was gone. Her relief was short-lived. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the car, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound grew louder, more distorted, until it became a cacophony of screams and whispers. Claire covered her ears, sinking to the floor. When the lights flickered back on, the car was no longer empty. Figures sat in every seat, their faces obscured by shadows. They were still, unmoving, like mannequins, but Claire could feel their eyes on her. She scrambled to her feet, her gaze darting around the car. The man in the Santa suit was standing at the far end, his arms outstretched. "All aboard," he said, his voice reverberating through her skull. The figures turned their heads in unison. their faces grotesque masks of decay, their mouths open, emitting a sound that was not human. Claire screamed, pounding on the doors with all her strength. The train began to slow, but the Santa was moving toward her, his steps deliberate and unhurried. With a final jolt, the train screeched to a stop. The doors hissed open, and Claire tumbled onto the platform. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not daring to look back. Her heels echoed in the empty station as she fled up the stairs and into the cold night air. When she finally stopped, gasping for breath, she realized she was standing in front of her apartment building. She turned to look at the subway entrance, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, covered in undisturbed snow. Claire didn't take the subway again after that night, but every Christmas Eve, she would hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, followed by a low, gravelly voice whispering, "All aboard." Story number 3. The Bell on Wall Street. It was the kind of bitterly cold December night that makes the city feel hollow. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the usual chaos of New York, and Wall Street stood eerily quiet. The towering buildings loomed like sentinels, their windows dark and uninviting. At the corner, St. Trinity's bell tower rose into the night sky, its bells poised to ring in the midnight hour of Christmas Eve. For centuries, the bells had marked moments of joy, grief, and everything in between. But this night was different. In 1920, Wall Street had been the scene of one of the most brutal attacks in the city's history. A bomb exploded outside the J.P. Morgan building, killing dozens and wounding hundreds more. Blood stained the cobblestones, mingling with glass and twisted metal. The perpetrators were never caught, and the dead were never truly at rest. Locals whispered that every Christmas Eve, the ghosts of the victims returned, drawn by the mournful tolling of the church bells. Henry Madsen, the new night watchman at the stock exchange, had heard the stories. He dismissed them as nonsense, urban legends meant to keep the superstitious in line. A stout man with graying hair and a gruff demeanor, Henry had worked security for decades and thought he'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would face that night. His shift started as usual. He clocked in at 10 p.m., exchanging brief nods with the guard he was relieving. The building's interior was vast and cold, its marble floors gleaming under the dim light of old chandeliers. Henry settled into his small office near the lobby, pouring himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. Outside, snow continued to fall, thick and silent. At 11:45 p.m., Henry decided to do a final patrol of the building. He wrapped his scarf tightly around his neck and grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkened hallways, casting long shadows on the ornate walls. The stock exchange felt especially empty tonight, as though the very air had been drained from its rooms. He told himself it was just the holiday. Everyone was home with their families. The first strange sound came as he passed the main trading floor. A faint hum, low and melodic, drifted through the cavernous space. Henry stopped, shining his flashlight around. The room was empty, the rows of desks and monitors undisturbed. He shook his head, muttering about faulty heating systems, and moved on. As he approached the building's rear exit, the hum grew louder, morphing into a distinct tune. It was a hymn, haunting and familiar. Silent Night. Henry's grip tightened on his flashlight. The song seemed to emanate from outside, pulling him toward the heavy wooden doors. He hesitated for a moment before unlatching them and stepping into the snowy street. Wall Street was deserted, the snow absorbing any sound except for the distant peal of Trinity's bells, which began their midnight chime. Henry's breath fogged in the icy air as he scanned the street. That's when he saw them. A procession of pale figures moved silently through the snow, their outlines barely distinguishable from the swirling flakes. They wore clothing from another era, pinstripe suits, bowler hats, flapper dresses. Their faces were stark white, their eyes hollow. They glided forward as if their feet didn't touch the ground. Henry blinked, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hey, who's there?" he called, his voice echoing against the tall buildings. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they continued their march, heading straight for the site of the 1920 bombing. The church bells tolled again, their mournful song filling the air. Henry's instincts screamed at him to retreat, but curiosity got the better of him. He stepped off the curb, his boots crunching in the snow, and followed the apparitions. As he drew closer, he noticed something chilling. The snow beneath the figures wasn't white. It was streaked with red. Blood seeped from their footsteps, staining the pristine ground. Henry stopped, his stomach churning. He wanted to turn back, but his legs refused to obey. The figures reached the center of the street and halted in unison. One of them turned to face him. It was a woman, her dress tattered and burned, her face twisted in an expression of sorrow and rage. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Henry took a shaky step forward, and then another. The bells tolled again, louder now, reverberating through his skull. The woman raised her hand, pointing to the ground at her feet. Slowly, Henry lowered his gaze. The cobblestones were cracked and blackened, as if frozen in time from the day of the bombing. Henry's flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the scene. When he looked up, the procession had formed a circle around him. Their hollow eyes bore into him, and the air grew impossibly cold. "What do you want?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her mouth opened, and this time, a single word escaped. "Remember." Henry stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam spinning wildly. The figures advanced, their faces contorting into grotesque masks of anguish. Henry scrambled to his feet and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he was back inside the stock exchange. Slamming the door behind him, he leaned against the door, his chest heaving. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the banging. Slow, deliberate knocks reverberated through the wood, shaking it on its hinges. Henry backed away, his eyes wide. The knocks grew louder, more insistent. He covered his ears, but the sound penetrated, filling his head with a deafening roar. And then it stopped. Henry lowered his hands. Trembling, he crept toward the door and peered through the small glass pane. The street was empty. The snow had erased all traces of the procession, leaving the ground pristine once more. But as his eyes scanned the scene, he noticed something etched into the snow directly in front of the door. A single word, "Remember." The next morning, Henry resigned. He packed his belongings and left the city, vowing never to set foot on Wall Street again. But the memory of that night haunted him, creeping into his dreams and waking moments alike. Every Christmas Eve, when the bells of Trinity Church rang out, he swore he could hear the faint hum of Silent Night and the echo of footsteps in the snow. Years later, a new night watchman took Henry's place. On his first Christmas Eve shift, he found himself drawn to the heavy wooden doors. As the bells tolled midnight, he opened them, stepping into the cold night. The snow was falling thick and fast, muffling the world around him. And there, in the distance, he saw them, a procession of pale figures gliding silently through the snow, their footsteps leaving streaks of red in their wake. Story number 4. Spooky toy store in Brooklyn. In the heart of Brooklyn, nestled between a defunct bakery and an old pawn shop, stood a forgotten toy store. The sign, faded and cracked, read "Timeless Treasures" in peeling gold letters. The place had been shuttered for decades, a relic of another era, until one bitterly cold December, just weeks before Christmas. The doors reopened. The news spread quickly among the neighborhood. The store's new owner had inherited it from a distant relative and decided to bring it back to life. But for all the nostalgic joy it promised, something about the place felt wrong. The interior was an enchanting time capsule. Wooden shelves bowed under the weight of antique dolls, clockwork trains, and jack-in-the-boxes with their painted grins. The air smelled faintly of cedar and varnish, mixed with something else, something metallic and sour. Children begged their parents to take them inside, and many did, charmed by the vintage allure. Among the eager customers was a boy named Henry. Henry was 8, small for his age, with a mop of dark curls and a curious streak that often got him into trouble. He walked into timeless treasures clutching his mother's hand, his wide eyes darting from one shelf to the next. His gaze landed on a peculiar item, a tin soldier doll standing stiffly in its box, his painted red uniform immaculate, its metal boots polished to a shine. The soldier's eyes, piercing blue, seemed almost too vivid, too alive. "I want this one, Mom," Henry said, tugging her sleeve. His mother hesitated, eyeing the price tag. The toy was old, but not expensive, and something about its craftsmanship was unsettling. Still, she relented, thinking it was harmless enough. Henry carried the box out of the store with a grin, unaware that his life had just taken a sinister turn. That night, Henry placed the soldier on his dresser, right across from his bed. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought he heard a faint click, like the sound of metal against wood. He sat up, blinking in the darkness. The soldier was exactly where he'd left it, its unblinking eyes staring straight ahead. Shaking off his unease, he pulled the covers over his head and forced himself to sleep. The next morning, Henry woke to find the soldier on the floor, lying face down. He frowned, picking it up. "Did you fall?" he murmured, placing it back on the dresser. He didn't mention it to his mother. By that evening, he'd forgotten the incident entirely, but the sounds came back that night. Click, clack, click, slow, deliberate, and closer than before. Henry's heart raced as he peeked over the edge of his blanket. The soldier had moved again, now perched on the edge of the dresser, its metal boots hanging over the side. His breath hitched. "Mom," he called, his voice trembling. When she came in, the soldier was back in its box, sitting innocently as if it had never moved. Over the following nights, the activity escalated. The sounds grew louder, the movements bolder. Henry's mother dismissed his complaints as nightmares, but Henry knew better. He started locking the doll in his closet, stuffing towels under the door to block the sounds. But each morning, he'd find it somewhere new, sitting on his desk, crouched on the windowsill, or worst of all, standing at the foot of his bed, his blue eyes glinting in the moonlight. By Christmas Eve, Henry was too afraid to sleep. He barricaded his bedroom door with a chair and stacked books against the closet. The soldier sat on the dresser again, staring at him with that unsettling intensity. Midnight came, and the house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Then he heard it. Click, clack. The sound was coming from inside his room. The barricaded door hadn't moved, nor had the closet. Slowly, he turned his head. The soldier was gone from the dresser. He felt something cold brush against his ankle. Henry screamed. His mother burst into the room moments later, but it was too late. Henry was gone. The chair at the door hadn't budged, and the windows were still latched from the inside. All that remained was a thin layer of frost coating the floor and a small, life-sized ice sculpture in the shape of her son. It was so detailed that it seemed alive, his face frozen in a silent scream. In its hands was the tin soldier, now grinning with sharp, metallic teeth. The toy store closed the next day. The owner vanished without a trace, leaving the building dark and empty once more. Those who had purchased toys from Timeless Treasures returned them hastily, claiming the items were cursed. The shelves of the abandoned shop began to fill with whispers of what had happened to Henry. Some said he was taken by the spirit of the toy soldier. Others believed he had become the ice sculpture itself, a warning to all who dared disturb the cursed shop. Months later, on an unusually warm spring morning, a local boy passing the storefront froze in his tracks. He could have sworn he saw something move behind the dusty glass. Peering closer, he saw the tin soldier standing on a shelf, its blue eyes gleaming like the frozen depths of a winter night. Before he could blink, the toy raised one hand and saluted. But this wasn't the end of the story. As rumors spread, the shop's notoriety grew. People started breaking in at night, desperate to see if the cursed toys were real. Most came out shaking their heads, laughing off the idea as a childish myth. Others never came out at all. Police reports noted bizarre occurrences. Missing persons cases spiked around the shop, and security cameras caught glimpses of shadows moving inside even though the building remained sealed. One particularly brave teenager, Elena, decided she would solve the mystery. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, she broke into timeless treasures on Halloween night. The air inside was thick and stale, the scent of varnish now replaced by something earthy, like decaying leaves. As her flashlight beam swept the room, the toys seemed to lean toward her, their painted faces frozen in expressions of malice. She whispered nervously to herself, "It's just a store, just old toys." But when she approached the shelf where the tin soldier supposedly stood, it was empty. A single set of footprints, small, metallic imprints, tracked across the dusty floor. She followed them, heart pounding, until they disappeared into the shadows near the back of the store. A faint sound came from the darkness. Click, clack, click, the soldier's boots. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she saw them, dozens of toys, now moving on their own, advancing toward her. At the forefront was the tin soldier, his grin wide and jagged, a twisted parody of a smile. Elena screamed, dropping her flashlight, and bolted for the door. She never made it. The next morning, another ice sculpture appeared in the window of Timeless Treasures. This one a perfect replica of Elena, her hands outstretched as if trying to push something away. The tin soldier stood beside her, saluting once more. After that, no one dared go near the shop. The building was eventually boarded up, but the toys and their sinister protector remained inside. On quiet nights, when the wind howls through the Brooklyn streets, some say you can still hear the faint sound of metal boots clicking against the wooden floor, waiting for the next unwitting victim to cross the threshold. Story number 5. Snowman on Fifth Avenue. On a bitterly cold December night, the kind of night where the air slices through your coat and the wind gnaws at your bones, Fifth Avenue in Manhattan was dressed in its holiday finest. Glittering lights were strung between lampposts, shop windows adorned with fake snow, and carolers sang beneath the massive Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center. Just a few blocks south, away from the warmth of crowds, something unsettling was taking shape. A homeless man, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, set up camp in the shadow of an abandoned storefront, his few belongings stacked neatly beside him. That night, as the snow fell thick and heavy, he decided to build a snowman. He worked with gloved hands, piling snow into 3 uneven spheres. He scavenged buttons for the eyes, a twig for the mouth, and a discarded scarf to wrap around its neck. For the nose, he used a broken piece of a bright orange traffic cone. When he stepped back to admire his work, he smiled for the first time in weeks. The snowman stood tall and proud, a lopsided monument to fleeting joy. By morning, the first person to notice was a jogger passing by at dawn. She stopped mid-stride, staring at the snowman. Something about it was off. Its eyes, those black buttons, seemed to follow her as she moved. She told herself it was her imagination, just a trick of the dim light, but as she jogged away, she felt it watching her. By the time the city woke up, word had spread. The snowman on Fifth Avenue wasn't like other snowmen. Its mouth, a crooked twig, seemed to form a sinister grin. Its button eyes gleamed red in the sunlight, as if lit from within. People stopped to take pictures, marveling at the eerie craftsmanship. A few claimed they saw it move, just slightly a twitch of the head, a shift of the shoulders. They laughed it off. Snowmen don't move. The homeless man returned to his makeshift shelter after a long day of panhandling. his pockets just a little heavier with coins. He was settling in when he heard a faint crunching sound, like boots on fresh snow. Looking up, he expected to see a passerby. Instead, he saw the snowman, standing under a street lamp. His shadow stretched long across the pavement. Its eyes glowed brighter now, twin pinpricks of crimson light. His grin had widened impossibly, revealing sharp edges where there had been none before. The man froze, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He tried to convince himself it wasn't real, just a trick of the light. Then it moved. The snowman took a step forward, his twig arms creaking as they reached out. Scrambling backward, he slipped on the ice, his heart hammering. Turning, he ran, not stopping until he was blocks away, hidden in an alley. When he finally dared to look back, the snowman was gone. Over the next few days, more people reported strange sightings. A woman walking home from a Christmas party swore she saw it standing beneath another street lamp, his eyes blazing like embers. A cab driver nearly crashed when it appeared in the middle of the road, only to vanish when his headlights hit it. Children playing in the snow claimed they heard it whispering their names. On Christmas Eve, the man's belongings were found neatly stacked where he'd left them, but there was no sign of him. All that remained was the snowman, now standing in his place. His grin was wider than ever, and its scarf fluttered in the wind as if it were alive. Some said it looked triumphant, as if it had claimed a prize. By Christmas morning, the snowman was gone, but the legend of the Fifth Avenue snowman had already taken root. People whispered about it in coffee shops and around dinner tables. Some said it was a spirit of the season, punishing those who had forgotten the true meaning of Christmas. Others believed it was a harbinger of something darker, a warning to those who ignored the suffering around them. Weeks passed, and the city returned to its usual rhythm. The snow melted, leaving the streets wet and gray. But for those who had seen the snowman, the unease lingered. They couldn't forget the way its button eyes seemed alive, the malice in its frozen smile. Some began avoiding Fifth Avenue altogether, taking longer routes to steer clear of the place where it had stood. It was a young couple walking home from a late dinner who saw it again, laughing, their breaths visible in the cold air. The woman suddenly stopped, grabbing her boyfriend's arm. Her face went pale. "Do you see that?" she whispered. He followed her gaze to a narrow alleyway. There, in the dim light of a flickering bulb, stood the snowman. Its eyes were brighter than before, glowing like coals in a dying fire. His grin seemed to stretch impossibly wide, revealing jagged teeth made of shards of ice. As they watched, took a single step forward. The couple ran, their laughter replaced by panicked screams. When they reached their apartment, they locked the door and closed the curtains, but the woman swore she could still feel it watching her, even from miles away. The next day, the alley was empty. No snow, no tracks, nothing to suggest the snowman had ever been there. But the story spread, feeding the growing legend. Now, it wasn't just Fifth Avenue. The snowman could appear anywhere in the city, always watching, always waiting. In the following months, the sightings became more frequent. A maintenance worker at Central Park claimed he saw it standing beneath a bridge, its reflection rippling in the icy water. A nanny pushing a stroller through the Upper West Side said it appeared behind her, its glowing eyes fixed on the child. A delivery driver in Queens swore it chased his van for 2 blocks before vanishing into a snowbank. Authorities dismissed the reports as urban legends, but the fear was real. People started carrying charms, crosses, and other talismans, hoping to ward off whatever malevolent force the snowman represented. Then came the disappearances. A teenager walking home from a friend's house vanished. An elderly woman who'd gone out to buy groceries was never seen again. Their belongings were always found neatly arranged where they'd last been seen, but the people themselves were gone. Each time, a snowman was found nearby, grinning its sinister grin. By March, the city was in a panic. Winter was fading, but the snowman didn't seem to care. It defied the changing season, appearing in places where snow hadn't fallen for weeks. People stopped going out after dark. The streets, once bustling and alive, became eerily quiet at night. Emma Langley, a journalist for a small local paper, decided to investigate, skeptical of the stories. She was convinced it was all a hoax or a case of mass hysteria. Armed with a camera and a notebook, she retraced the snowman's alleged appearances, interviewing witnesses and documenting their accounts. It wasn't until she visited the homeless shelter where the snowman's creator had occasionally stayed that she learned something chilling. A man there, grizzled and gray, pulled her aside and spoke in a low, trembling voice. "The snowman isn't just a thing," he said. "It's a hunger. It's looking for something, someone, and once it finds them, it doesn't let go." That night, Emma stayed on Fifth Avenue, her camera ready. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Midnight came and went, and she saw nothing. But as the clock struck 1, the temperature plummeted, the streetlights flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Then she saw it. The snowman stood beneath the street lamp, his eyes blazing like twin infernos. His grin was wider than ever, almost splitting its head in two. Emma froze, her camera slipping from her hands. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The snowman took a step toward her, and then another. It reached out with one twig arm, and in that moment, Emma understood. It wasn't just a snowman. It was something ancient, something malevolent. Story number 6. Chelsea Hotel Christmas Eve. The Chelsea Hotel, with its Gothic facade and towering iron balconies, loomed like a dark castle over Manhattan's West 23rd Street. It was a relic of another age, a place where time seemed to pool and stagnate. Over the decades, it had housed dreamers, artists, and madmen. Some left behind masterpieces, others left whispers and shadows. For James, Melissa, and their friends, the Chelsea was more than just a historic landmark. It was a portal to the unknown. They had booked room 206 for Christmas Eve, lured by tales of spectral artists and poets wandering the halls. Melissa, a photography student, hoped to capture evidence of the paranormal. James, ever the skeptic, came along for the laughs. The others, Rachel and Tom, simply wanted a thrill. They checked in on a snowy afternoon. The lobby, with its ornate ceiling and dim chandeliers, smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. The desk clerk, an older woman with a distracted air, barely looked up as she handed them the key. "Room 206, she said, her voice flat. "Don't open the windows." James chuckled. "Why not? Ghosts don't like fresh air." The clerk's eyes flicked to him, cold and sharp. "The windows stay closed." The room itself was a time capsule, faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and a massive, antique bed dominated the space. A narrow balcony stretched outside, accessible through a pair of heavy French doors. Melissa wasted no time unpacking her camera gear, while Rachel and Tom rummaged through the mini fridge for overpriced snacks. James wandered the room, inspecting its quirks. A strange chill seemed to emanate from the walls. Despite the hissing radiator, he stopped at the dresser, where a dusty leather-bound book lay open. The pages were blank, but when he ran his fingers over them, he thought he felt grooves, as if words had been pressed into the paper and erased. "Spooky enough for you?" he asked Melissa, who was adjusting her tripod by the window. She grinned. "We'll see at midnight." The evening passed in nervous laughter and exaggerated stories. They ordered pizza, drank cheap wine, and debated whether Dylan Thomas's ghost still roamed the halls. James was in the middle of a dramatic retelling of Thomas's last night at the Chelsea when the radiator suddenly went silent. Rachel shivered. "Great, now it's freezing." Tom pointed to the thermostat, which was cranked to maximum. "Weird, it's not working." Melissa glanced at her watch. "It's almost midnight." James rolled his eyes. Perfect timing for something creepy to happen. The clock on the bedside table ticked louder than before, each second an audible thud in the silence. Midnight came. The French doors rattled, their glass panes trembling as if struck by invisible hands. "It's the wind," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then, with a sharp crack, the doors flew open, snowflakes swirled in, and the group jumped to their feet. Melissa grabbed her camera, snapping wildly. The figure stood on the balcony, silhouetted against the city lights. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered overcoat. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. The man opened his mouth, and a rasping whisper filled the room. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage. Rage against the dying of the light." The voice was unmistakable, each word laden with sorrow and fury. Melissa's camera flashed, but the man didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the snowy balcony. James felt his knees buckle. "Who are you?" Melissa demanded, her voice trembling. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. He raised a skeletal hand, pointing to the leather-bound book on the dresser. Then he faded, dissolving into the night like smoke. The doors slammed shut, and the room was plunged into an eerie stillness. Melissa rushed to the dresser, flipping through the book. This time, the pages were filled with jagged handwriting, lines of poetry scrawled in ink so dark it looked wet. Rachel and Tom huddled on the bed, whispering prayers, while James stood frozen, his breath clouding in the icy air. The radiator roared to life, and the clock resumed its steady ticking. But the air remained heavy, oppressive. Melissa read aloud from the book, her voice shaking. "Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion." The words echoed, reverberating as if the room itself were reciting them. The French doors rattled again, and this time, Melissa slammed the book shut. "We need to leave," she said, her face pale. "Now." But when they tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The knob turned uselessly, and even James, with his full weight against it, couldn't force it open. The windows were frozen shut, their glass frosted over despite the heat from the radiator. The clock struck 12:15. A low hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. Shadows danced on the walls, figures that moved independently of the flickering lamp. One by one, they took shape. A woman in a flowing gown, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. A man clutching a paintbrush, his face streaked with blood. A musician, his fingers hovering over an invisible piano. "They're the artists," Rachel whispered. "The ones who died here." The figures moved closer, their expressions vacant but their intentions clear. Melissa snapped another photo, and for a split second, the flash revealed their true forms, grotesque, decayed, their hollow eyes brimming with malice. James grabbed a chair, swinging it at the nearest figure. It passed through the apparition harmlessly, and the chair splintered against the wall. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the group. Cold seeped into their skin, and the hum became a deafening roar. Just as Melissa thought she would black out, the leather-bound book flew open on its own. The pages flipped wildly, and the shadows recoiled. A blinding light burst forth, filling the room with a warmth that drove the cold away. The figures shrieked, their forms unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. The French doors slammed shut, and the light faded, leaving the group gasping on the floor. When they finally managed to open the door, the hallway was silent and empty. They fled the hotel, leaving their belongings behind. Melissa clutched her camera, her fingers numb and trembling. Days later, when she developed the photos, most were overexposed, the images washed out by streaks of white. But one picture stood out. It showed the balcony, empty except for a single figure. Dylan Thomas stood there, his face serene, his hand resting on the railing. Below him, etched into the snow, were the words, "Though lovers be lost, love shall not." Melissa burned the photograph that same night. None of them ever spoke of the Chelsea Hotel again. The city that never sleeps holds secrets darker than its winter nights. These 6 stories remind us that even during the most joyous season, shadows can creep into the brightest corners. Which tale haunted you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more terrifying stories that blur the line between myth and reality. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, not all Christmas tales have a happy ending.